We are live, people from Brazil and from Australia too. How are you? How are you, Terry? How are you, Kerrie?
Good morning, Paulo. I'm
Can you
great,
hear?
thank you. It's been really good to be here.
Yeah, good, Paulo. Nice to connect again. I'm actually I'm in the Blue Mountains, just out of Sydney. It's a stunning day here. It's supposed to be winter, but it's very mild. Where are you, Kerrie?
I'm actually in a place called Bow Hill on the River Murray, which is probably about halfway between where the Murray starts in South Australia and goes all the way up to the top and through Victoria. So I'm in South Australia on the beautiful River Murray. It's wonderful.
You missed out one important detail. You're actually on a houseboat.
I am.
With 6 others.
I am sitting on a houseboat with 6 others. It wasn't the plan, but our date changed, and I'm like, well, let's just make it work. So just outside of me here, you can't really see yet because it's still a bit foggy and early, is the river. I'll show you a bit later on during the webinar.
So I'm in Brazil. It's cold here, but in here is very it's very warm, and I have all things prepared for us to talk. For me, it's night. For you, it's morning. To tell those people who are with us right now, to tell them about what they're planning to do. So we're people where we have now 26 people with us. So we'll wait a little more for more people to come. We are expecting more than 200 people to be with us. So we'll talk a little bit of what we're doing right now in this COVID situation. You in Australia, we're not having problems with COVID. That's it. In Brazil, the things are very, very ugly. But how are the things in Australia about the COVID?
Kerrie, go.
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say, Paulo, that comparative to your country, I think we are we're very lucky to be in a bit different space to you. However, we do have one of our states, Victoria, which very sadly is struggling, but certainly not to the numbers you are. But on a whole, we're doing okay. But we're certainly thinking of our Victorian counterparts and colleagues who are in the middle of a 6-week lockdown, and it's their second lockdown. So I know that they're struggling over there, and I've got some friends and colleagues who are in that situation. But really think and feel for you, Paulo, and Brazil, and also some of my really dear friends in the United States. I think we've got some problems over there, but we're doing okay. What do you think, Terry?
Yeah, look, relatively speaking, we've done very well. In fact, even though Victoria is struggling with some numbers, it really is pretty much under control. I spent a week in Bolivia last year with my friend Jean Smith from Peru, and I sadly got an email yesterday, and our friends in Bolivia are devastated. COVID has infected all parts, even the Prime Minister. In fact, we worked with the Bolivian police, and the police chief himself has got COVID. And they've got the highest sort of death rates. So, yeah, our hearts go out to everyone who's struggling around this.
Paulo, you're on mute, mate.
Sorry, Kate is asking if we can see the comments. Yes, we can see your comments. You can make your comments. I can put you on the screen. For example, David Crew is saying hi. Hello, I am viewing from Wamba, Perepa, country in Denley. I don't know where it is. I probably making some jokes.
I say David's in Denny. Hi, David.
Yeah, Kate Clarkson is on Gadigal land.
Gadigal land, yeah, that's right.
Gadigal land.
Yeah, we know
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, you can put your comments in this chat. We can interact with you. We can ask some questions. Would be such a pleasure for us to interact with you guys. So yes, we can see your comments, and we are willing to interact with you. Okay, so well, we're probably going to start. What do you think, Terry and Kerrie? Can we start?
Yeah, we're ready to go, Paulo. Can I just check with you, Paulo? I've had a couple of people messaging already saying, can we share that your live stream on your page? Have you made it so that it can be shared with all?
Of course, they can share from the. We are live on Facebook, on my personal page, in your page too, Kerrie. I'll put here my. That's my page on Facebook, Paulo H. Moratelli. So we can share from there, or from the. You can invite people to watch it later. It will be recorded here on the YouTube channel. We'll get it here recorded, so you can invite people to watch it later too. It's your call. You'll have someone from New Zealand. Oh,
Jacob.
Yeah. Oh, who? Look, Terry, who's here?
Gemma Edgar. Justin and Gemma Edgar. That's where our New Zealand counterpart came from, our friend Gemma. Hey, Justin.
Yeah.
Justin's in Singapore.
Yeah. Thank you, Justin, to be for being with us. So let's go. A few weeks ago, we three of us have some conversation here on the YouTube. This video is available from whoever wants to see. And in this first, we did it by using Zoom that time. Now we're using StreamYard, another. It's the same thing in a sense. So in that day, we were inviting you to this free webinar, and the idea here, Terry and Kerrie, is talk between us, interact with people who was with us, who are with us here. Just pointing two major things. We want to ask two questions and want to probably answer those two questions. Why you do what you do and why doing that works. This is a major thing for us, don't it, Terry? You want to talk a little bit about it?
No, I think, well, our hope is that through the conversation, those who are with us today will be able to, I guess, be able to answer that in their own way. And it'll become fairly apparent why we've asked those questions, because it really has to do with the heart of what today's about. And that
I was just making make some provocation with you, Terry. Of course, this question is for you who are listening to us, who are watching us, to answer, not us. We're not answering that. You know, our role here is to ask those questions and talk a little bit about it. So these two questions, we want you, every one of you that are watching us, to have those questions in mind before all the time that we will be together today, okay? So these questions for us is very important. They are very important. We share with you I need to share with you that those two questions Terry asked me and when I first met him. And it made my mind such in a bad place that time, because I was a very experienced practitioner, facilitator at that time, but I wasn't ready to answer those questions. I guess it happened also with Kerrie. So the difficulty for me at that time is I was constantly asked to talk about what to do, how we do the things, the circles and etc., the mediation stuff. So I asked Terry last year for a conference here in Brazil, in Brasilia. It's a big conference with people from 7 countries, etc. So I was introduced by Ted Wachtel. Thank you, Ted. I always thank Ted for that. I was introduced to Terry, and Terry, I invited him. He said yes right away, and I asked him, "What do you want to talk in this conference, Terry?" And she said, my presentation will be without the why, the what looks like more of the same. And I read it. What do you mean, guy? What are you talking to me? What are you talking when you say the without the why, the what looks more of the same? And he started explaining me, and I said, that's it. That's the missing bit for me. That's the missing piece for me to really become a more intentional practitioner, etc. So understanding the why is very important to us. Before I pass on to Terry and Kerrie, we want to show you a short video that talk a little bit about what we're talking here. I don't know if you already know that video, but it's very interesting. Just look at it.
How do I know? A lot of people, when they think of the phrase, how do I know, they always want to put the what behind it. How do I know what I'm supposed to do? The question that you really should ask is, how do I know why I'm here? Because when you know your why, your what becomes more clear and more impactful. If you know, like for instance, people know that I do comedy, but that's what I do. My why is to inspire people to walk in purpose. So I can do comedy, I can write books, I can be in a movie, because all of it is motivated by my why. In fact, I have a new web series out called Michael Jr. Break Time. We probably just did the 6th episode. It's on YouTube. So every single Wednesday at 3 o'clock, we drop a new episode on YouTube of Michael Jr. Break Time. What it is it's me. I travel around the country and I do stand-up comedy, in case you know. And in the middle of my comedy set sometime, I'll stop and just talk to my audience. And we've been filming this, and it's pretty cool. So we're in Winston-Salem. I'm going to show you a clip from Winston-Salem. And I'm just talking to this guy in the audience, and he tells me that he's a musical instructor at a school. So I was like, all right, you're a musical instructor. Can you sing? Let me hear you sing a song. So this is what happened at the last episode of Michael Jr.'s Break Time. Check it. So you're a musical director. Cool.
Yes, sir.
All right, so let me get a couple bars of like Amazing Grace. Can you do the first part of that? Go ahead.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
Wow. That bro could sing. You know what I'm saying? All right. Now, what you give me the version is if your uncle just got out of jail, you got shot in the back when you was a kid. I'm just saying, let me see the hood version real quick, if you know which version I'm talking about. Just see if that exists. Let me see what you got.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I was lost, but now
Yeah, mate.
now I see. Let's go. Yeah.
Okay. Here's what I want you to catch. The first time I asked him to sing, he knew what he was doing. The second time, he knew why he was doing it. When you know your why, your what becomes more impactful because you're walking towards or in your purpose.
Great. So today we will share with you guys who are watching us how each of us develop our practice in more explicit, consistent, and impactful ways. How knowing our why was significantly changed how we know engage others. So Terry, what do you think if you begin sharing how you arrived at the idea of explicit practice and the importance of understanding the why? So just before I start, I invite you guys and how everyone that was watching us, if you have some questions, you can write it down, any comments, and we will be very happy to interact with you. Okay? So Terry, talk to us a little bit about this explicit practice.
Thanks, Paulo. Yeah, there are a number of influences that led me to develop the idea of an explicit practice framework that really, unsurprisingly, began with the search for understanding the why. In fact, it's an ongoing search. However, just a very quick reflection on the video that everyone just watched, because it really has significant implications for how you and I practice. When Winston-Salem sang Amazing Grace for the second time, it was very different. The first occasion was just a routine. The second occasion was more of a ritual. The question is, what was the difference? Michael Jr. talked about being motivated by the why, so he added a whole lot of emotional dimensions that in the second rendition, Winston exhibited a whole lot of emotions, and if you watch that for the first time, no doubt, you were drawn in by those emotions. In fact, the reason that happened is because of what we call effective resonance, something that Sylvan Tompkins, whose theory of the psychology of affects, it's a theory of human motivation, helps us to understand why this is so. But there are two key practice issues that come out of the video that are really important for me. And the first is that understanding how our values, beliefs, experiences heavily influence our motivation and in turn shape our working assumptions that provide us with a practice roadmap. Now, we're going to unpack that as we go through it. The second consideration, and I really want you to think, the idea of actually having an individual explain their motivation and rationale for why they do what they do has significant benefits. So one of the things that will come out of this conversation is how we end up explicitly sharing, not only with our colleagues, but those we're reaching out to, what we do, what motivates us, etc. What I'll do now is to go into some greater detail about why I hit across the idea of the significance of being explicit and this continual search for understanding the why. It's been an interesting exercise because began to realise over many years of being involved that where those influences have really come from. But let me just stop a moment by asking the question, what do I mean by explicit? And the reason I'm asking this question is because I actually don't make an assumption that each of us share the same understanding of explicit. In fact, one of the strong features of my practice is my constant need to test assumptions. And it's to do with what I call a Socratic engagement style. Socrates, if you know anything about Socrates, his strength was he simply asked questions in order to make us stop and think about things we took for granted. So a strong characteristic of my practice is the fact that I only rely on questions and allow others to work out the answers. But in practical terms, by explicit, I mean being able to articulate what I do, why I do that, why doing that works, and importantly, how my practice is able to consistently deliver outcomes that matter to those I'm reaching out to. But that's only one part of being explicit. The other part is developing a practice narrative that allows it allows me to develop a practice narrative that I can reach out to others in a way that allows them to replicate that in their own lives. This will become very apparent when we get Kerrie to talk about her experience of developing an organisation called Re-engage Youth Services. One of the things you'll hear regularly throughout the seminar is the idea of what matters, a question that is really at the core of our practice. What it does critically is it avoids the assumption that we all know what good outcomes look like for others. In other words, the starting place in engaging others is to acquire what matters for them. And then it allows us to think about what matters for us in terms of our practice, what matters in terms of how we engage others. Let me now just quickly identify those factors that I think significantly have influenced my thinking about the idea of being explicit. I was one of 10 children in an Irish Catholic family, and I've always been interested in what motivates people. You know, my dad used to say it's really easy to judge people, but very often hard to actually get it right. And I guess the point he was making is when you see a behaviour, you can be critical, but when you get to really understand their story, you're in a much better space to be able to engage. So I became a police officer in 1971. Why? Motivated by the idea of being able to help others, which is not unusual. I mean, most of us, are heavily motivated by wanting to do something that helps others. But funnily enough, I was quickly known as Questions, the young constable who would ask lots of questions, mainly silly ones like, why do we do that given it doesn't seem to make any sense? You know? And the answer was pretty clear. So my early formative policing experience made me realise that compliance was the central focus of most policing, and we never talked about what mattered. In the Zoom, I told the story of Kerrie in 1973, June of 1973. Kerrie, a young 14-year-old, was involved in a fight. I was a young police officer. I attended, saw this young kid fighting. I managed to secure him from behind. I held him. I whispered in his ear, "Settle down, we can work it out. What's your name?" He said, "Kerrie." I removed him from the hall, and he had relaxed. I let go of him, and I turned to beckon the young people who were following him, who he's fighting with. And as I looked back, bang, I got hit in the right eye. Knocked me to the ground, got up, and I grabbed him again. My colleague, who was an experienced police officer, went to pull out the handcuffs. I said, "Don't handcuff him." Then my colleague said, he's done it on this occasion. He's been charged twice already with assault, and now he'll go to juvenile prison. I guess what happened with Kerrie and myself was a bit of watershed moment, because rather than charge him the following afternoon, I met with Kerrie and his mum. My eye was swollen, and we're in a little room, 3 chairs. His mum was very upset. Kerrie's head was down, overwhelmed with shame. And I was trying to work out why Kerrie was behaving in that way. Everyone knew what he was doing. He was behaving, he committed a crime, etc., etc. But I was of the view, unless we understood the why, he wasn't going to make a different choice. He was never going to learn from it. So in the conversation, I said to his mum, "Who is this young guy?" And she burst into tears and said, "Look, I love him dearly. He's one of 2 kids, and I've been concerned about him for the last 12 months. He's become very angry." And I said, "What changed? What do you think influenced that?" She said, "Well, the only thing I could think of was 14 months ago, his dad was killed." The moment she mentioned that, Kerrie burst into tears, and I said to Kerrie, "Tell me about your dad." And we had this conversation. The reality was, he was a young 14-year-old, didn't know how to deal with the tremendous grief and, I guess, trauma of the loss of his dad. And what I've subsequently got to learn is that his inability to deal with his vulnerability, triggered by the affect of shame, and no capacity to deal with it in healthy ways, resulted in him behaving badly. And we'll cover that in a little bit more detail. Why I say it's a watershed moment, because it was largely a template I use as a cop in how I policed. In fact, I estimate there were probably 5 or 6 occasions in which I was assaulted, and I never resorted to using the criminal justice system. I reckon that dialogue, engagement, insight learning was able to consistently deliver better outcomes than resorting to criminal justice processes. 15 years after the incident around Kerrie, I was in the same hall, and I got a tug on my shirt, and I turned around. He was Gary, and a 29-year-old. And I had a flashback. He said, "Do you remember me?" I said, "Of course I remember you. You hit me in the eye." Then he said, I never really understood why someone who I'd hit, who was a police officer, chose to sit down and talk about it. I said, "Tell me what's happened for you since." He went on to tell the story, a great story. Never got into trouble. You know, I'm now married, got 2 kids, and life's great. And I said, that's the reason why. If I sort of just progress to in 1989, in a place called Wagga Wagga, which is midway between Melbourne and Sydney, it's a large regional city, rural city. I was appointed the sergeant in charge of a group of 14 young police. And I saw it as my opportunity to actually change the conversation, to engage them in a way that allowed us to focus on what mattered, as opposed to this overwhelming sense of compliance. And these 14 young cops didn't want to be in the group, were transferred. It was one of those political decisions that was made to create a proactive element in large policing areas, and I was fortunate to be appointed the sergeant in charge. For 2 days, we sat in circles, and I relentlessly asked them questions. I had each of them tell their story. Why did you become a police officer? What were your expectations? What's your experience? To what extent are your expectations, have they been met? What I discovered was this is the first occasion they had ever talked about policing, which was no surprise. And over the next 12 months, we developed what was called a strategic operational plan. They thought I would do that. No, we did it in a collaborative way. And one of the features of how we did it was we ran a police and community forum of 300 local community members coming together, talking about their expectations of us as police and our expectations of community. And we landed on what was a mandate for 2 years, that if we think about what's happening in terms of policing throughout the world now, that's a bit missing. See, the mistake is to think about policing as synonymous with police, when in fact policing is really about governance or community government. But why did that process work? Why was it so effective? Because the idea of actually sitting and creating a space in which everyone was invited was really reflective of the process that I then used to develop, I used when engaging offenders, victims, and their respective families. One of the key focuses of our sort of operational plan was young people. They were seen as the priority. So we did a whole lot of interesting work, but ultimately it created the opportunity to fundamentally change how I, as a sergeant, administered warnings and cautions. Now, what was particular about what happened in early 1991 was John McDonnell, who was the youth advisor to the New South Wales Police Commissioner, arrived and talked about an experience of going to New Zealand And in New Zealand, they had developed what was called a family group conference. In fact, there was legislation passed in 1989. He had written this paper with another police officer called "Can It Be Done Another Way?" What that did was, firstly, reminded me of my encounter with Kerrie, but intuitively, I understood what this was about. And so from that moment on, I started developing what was called a restorative approach to cautioning. And in essence, it was about developing a conversation that invited young offenders, their families, and victims into the same space so they could get to work out what mattered, what was important. What was particular about that was that John McDonnell also alerted us to a book by John Braithwaite, professor of criminology. This is seen as a seminal work. It's called Crime, Shame and Reintegration, published in the same year that New Zealand had legislated for family group conferences. But John Braithwaite was unaware of the New Zealand developments, and what happened was we invited him to come to Wagga, and that was the beginning of a relationship or a collaboration that lasted until today, still ongoing. What John did was develop this basic theory that said, you know what, if we pay attention to how we engage those who have made poor choices and do it in a supportive and respectful way, which means that we actually separate the behaviour from the person, we're likely to create the conditions that foster reconnection and stronger relationships. Now, what was interesting about our collaboration was that John came to Wagga on many occasions and sat and observed many of the processes that I ran. In fact, I used to write them up as case studies and send them to him. And one of his papers was called The Conditions for Successful Reintegration. At the same time, a guy by the name of David Moore, who was a lecturer at the Charles Sturt University, and by the way, I, as a cop, went to the Charles Sturt University in the mid-'80s and got a social welfare degree. I met David and invited David to, like John Braithwaite, observe the processes. What David was fascinated with was it didn't matter the nature of the incident I was dealing with, its seriousness, how many were involved. There seemed to be a consistent pattern in terms of emotions throughout the whole process. And what had happened was within a 6-month period, I had intuitively developed a conference script that had as its core a set of key questions. You might show those, Paulo. These questions I later uplifted and put them on little cards. And basically, it's when things go wrong. The second set was when someone's been harmed. Now, initially, the script that I had developed that had these at the centre, the core of it, the only time these questions I noticed practitioners were asking them was when they in the conference process itself, when in fact they had these questions, I soon realised had universal applications, and were as applicable one-on-one to large groups. More of that later. What was really unusual about the development of my practice was that we found theories that did two things. One, provided us with a clear understanding of why our practices worked, and made what we're doing much more predictable and consistent. So here we had a sociological theory and we had a psychological theory, because the bit I haven't mentioned was that David Moore found Sylvan Tompkins' work that I had earlier alluded to, and in particular, Professor Don Nathanson, who was based in Philadelphia. He had written a book called Shaman Pride. And I guess I met Don Nathanson in 1994. I was on a Church of Fellowship, and we developed a very collaborative relationship until his death, I think it was about 4 years ago. Basically, Tompkins has developed this simple template for emotional well-being that Nathanson took as a template for building relationships. And briefly talks about affects being hardwired, and that relationships are built when we can amplify those that make us feel good, we can reduce those that make us feel awful, and we live at our best when we can achieve those conditions. Now, that's the sort of the early background. There are a couple more things that did influence what I was on about, in terms of why I found it really important to understand the why, and as a result, develop my practice in a way that was explicit and importantly that I could share with others. And a lot of what I've learnt, funnily enough, comes from working with teachers, which really should be no surprise. In fact, I began working and sharing what I was developing with teachers in 1993. Something struck me as being unusual. The level of enthusiasm towards this restorative thing surprised me. They thought it was revolutionary. And I wondered, a profession that I think is probably one of the noblest, because it is that community institution that connects our young people, and is built around relationships. I wondered why this group was so excited. So it caused me to ask them about their practice. I said, in your groups, I really want you to stop and think about what it is you do and why you do it and why doing it works. And you know, what I got to understand is that whilst most of what they did worked, they struggle, like Paulo, like Kerrie, like us all, to understand the why. Now, the standard answer I would get was, to that question, was, I've never been asked that question. Now, there was another significant influence. Here I was operating as a cop and working with a whole lot of agencies. And when I looked at what was happening with those agencies, I thought to myself, it's pretty much like policing, where the preoccupation is about compliance. And in fact, Hillary Cotton, in an excellent TED talk called Why Social Services Are Broken, shared a story called of Ellen's family, a family experiencing generational crisis that was being supported by 72 different agencies from out of 24 government departments, and yet nothing had changed. I want you to think about it. 72 different services out of 24 government agencies, nothing changed. Why was this so? Now, Cotton says the fundamental issue really was the fact that when you interrogated what they were doing, they spent 90% of their time and resources servicing what she calls the system. In other words, my point about system compliance overshadows the need to think about what matters. And my strong feeling around what she was talking about is that good intentions and strong commitment combined with poor practice really offer a fairly toxic mix, and the likelihood of making a difference is pretty limited. Cotton concluded that the power of relationships to solve the complex social challenges of today's society was where the answer was to be found. But let me just share an observation of practice generally, and I'm talking generally. It's mostly explicit. It lacks rigor and consistently fails to achieve its full potential. Now, by that I mean that what's really on offer, if it were explicit, whilst it may work, the idea of making it much more explicit is going to, more likely than not, allow it to reach its full potential. Let me give you a simple example of this. I was working in Canada and working with 200 teachers, and I said to them, I need to ask you a question. I had them in groups. I had them talking about what motivated them to be teachers, what their experience of the school was, the good moment they had last year, their worst moment, and really what they wanted to take out of this one-day experience. The answers they gave were, I need another tool. And it prompted me to raise the question. I said to them, as a complete outsider, as someone who was a cop, never a teacher, who's come and is making an offering that somehow is based on an assumption that this offering was going to help them strengthen and improve their practice. I said, what would I have to demonstrate, or what would you want to benchmark or measure what I had to offer against? I said, because I understand that the pedagogy of what you're doing is about the art of teaching and learning. That, more importantly, is connected with a body of knowledge. And most of them, their eyes glazed over, because whilst they got what I was on about, it was very clear to me that the reason their practice lacked rigor was that they had no longer linked it to that very body of knowledge that informed and provided the rationale for what it is they were doing. Now, one of the things that I did, and I was fortunate, was to have collaborated with some key teachers in a couple of key schools. I go back to the early 2000s when a teacher by the name of Shanty Clemens came and watched me working with teachers, students, and parents, and developed a document which demonstrated the alignments between restorative practice and quality teaching framework. In fact, Lynn Doppler, who I had worked with for about 6 years, was the principal of a school called Roselle. Lynn had integrated restorative, was a troubled school, inner city school. Within 6 years, doubled in size and became an exemplar, a lighthouse school. She had developed restorative and integrated it at every level, both in terms of how they built their collegial relationships, how they engaged kids, how they integrated this in terms of their curriculum. In fact, I have a document here which is an example of how Lynn was able to link what she calls 3 complementary frameworks, the restorative framework, the wellbeing framework, and the quality teaching framework. Now, this is what I concluded very simply, a simple observation. I said, when practitioners are looking for yet another program, it signals to me that their existing practice isn't quite working in the way they'd hope. To then offer them a restorative approach without interrogating the why of their practice, for me, is really aiding and abetting their simple, limited practice. So the idea of bolting on restorative to some questionable practice simply isn't going to cut it. I realised fairly early that what I had initially developed as a program for dealing with young people, victims and their respective families, as a response to wrongdoing, was really, the moving bits of it, was really a relational program, a relational foundation with universal application for all practice. My thinking shifted from correcting behaviour to building relationships. And against that backdrop of history, I then focus on building an explicit practice framework. And I encouraged practitioners to discover what worked and to look for ways to make their practice more explicit, intentional, consistent, and impactful. My point is that I didn't wake up one day and imagine I had a good idea, and that the good idea was I'm going to develop a program for young people. Well, it wasn't about young people. I was a cop. It was about how I changed policing. And my initial focus was how we responded to juveniles in a much more respectful and inclusive way. I'm going to stop at this point because I actually want to invite Kerrie and Paulo in to share their journeys. I connected with Kerrie in 2009, although she says that she was in one of my trainings earlier, and I didn't want to offend her by saying I didn't remember her, but that's the truth. Kerrie has become a really important collaborator and companion. She seriously courageous, and went on to develop an organisation that became the leading edge youth organisation in Australia, called Re-engage Youth Services. We met in 2009, and she's still having flashbacks about our initial meeting. In fact, she said, I thought you were going to talk about restorative, but you haven't left me alone, asked me questions about motivation and my practice and all the rest of it. But it's been a great story, and what we'll use is that story as a case study, so we unfold at a later point what we mean by an explicit practice framework, because everything we do not only has to link to and influence the outcomes, which is stronger relationships, but we must be able to clearly and fully explain the why of each of those elements. I'll hand it over to you, Kerrie.
Thanks, Terry. Yeah, I remember that day fondly, and also a little bit scarily, I guess, in 2009. I guess what I expected was that you were going to come. I was looking for this program. I was looking for something that was going to make fundamentally our experience as staff and practitioners different, but also outcomes for young people, families and communities. And I thought I was looking for a program, and I thought Terry was going to come and give me this incredible program that was going to make the greatest difference. And he asked me a whole bunch of questions instead. And I guess it was a turning point in my career where for the first time I fundamentally realised that it was practice that was going to make the greatest difference and not programs. And yeah, we journeyed along, and the whole point about explicit practice is what became really, really evident, and a way that we share that practice with our staff and with others is what changed. And we started doing everything through a restorative lens, and we started to slowly but surely build our experiences. And what we realised through that journey, and Terry, you probably remember, very early on, we developed what we called the 4 pillars of restorative practice, because what didn't make sense to us as practitioners was doing this thing to young people and families that we didn't do and be ourselves. And so we developed the 4 pillars, pillar number 1 being, how do I be restorative with myself? If I can't self-regulate and repair my relationship with myself, how on earth can I be in relationship with others? So how can I then be in relationship with my colleagues? That was pillar number 2. How do we then be relational with each other? And then number 3 was about how do we be explicit with our young people and families, but also to share and articulate our practice in a way that they got to understand it and got to replicate it in their own lives. And those 4 pillars is where it fundamentally shifted for us as an organisation and as individuals and as practitioners, where we actually realised that we needed to start working with ourselves first. And that was the beginning of the journey from there. And Terry, we worked alongside with you for a very long time, and I guess we started embedding this in everything we did. The rigorous circle work that we would do on a regular basis with our staff, having challenging conversations, but we created the conditions for staff where they were able to be their best and to be vulnerable, I guess, in their practice. Terry, where do you want to head from here?
Paulo, just briefly, and I want to come back to you. Paulo, we first met in May of last year, even though it seems like a lifetime, in Brasilia. And I was struck by Paulo's openness and keenness to learn, despite being a very experienced practitioner, apart from being a psychologist, has spent over a decade developing restorative approaches. And some of the matters that Paulo dealt with were of the most serious nature. And yet he was keen to actually discover the bit that he felt was missing, and that's the why. So, Paulo, just share a little bit about your transition from what I call the implicit to the explicit, and importantly, how that changed your thinking and practice.
Well, Terry, as you already know, the thing is, much of the work that I have done before was on serious stuff, as you said, on homicide, gender violence, sexual abuse, and so on, children, adolescents, in foster care, etc. So the practices are happening. So whether it was good, it was functioning, but the why is always a problem. Was always a problem, and it became a bigger problem when I start doing my own trainings and courses and etc. Because usually people say, "Oh, the circle is wonderful, it's amazing, it's a magical stuff," but it doesn't explain why it happens, why it works. So I really needed to explain why it works. I tried everything. I tried to talk with people from philosophy, sociology, psychology, and you can name it. But the problem is, everyone was missing that bit too. So when I invited you to our conference last year in Brasilia, as we start exchanging emails, and you talk about this why, I said, that's it. I need to know much more about it. So that's precisely the point that I was looking for. So after we start talking, after the Brasilia conference, after I brought you again to Brazil for 2 or 3 more trainings, workshops, and etc. So the things start to happen. Yeah, I really became aware of what's happening on the why we're doing and why it works. So after that, it became much more clear to me to be an explicit practitioner, explicit facilitator, as you prefer. I can manage to explain to people in my training, my workshops, what is happening here, what is happening in this mediation, this conflict transformation. So Terry, not only it changed the way that I facilitate dialogues, but it changed the way that I can explain to others, the way that I can teach my stuff, my which I now call transformative dialogue is the practice that I use, but doesn't matter. You can use circles, restorative circles, peacemaking circles, conferencing, and victim offender mediation. Doesn't matter. The thing is, the why is the most important stuff. So when you came to Brazil talking about your work and assumptions, talking about fair processes, relational styles, the Socratic engagement, I already was using that one. But for example, I didn't know at that time that you were the one who created the restorative questions. And not only you came to me with this restorative question, but we really dissecate these questions. We look at each one and why you do that question in that sequence, and why you do not ask some type of questions, for example. So Terry, it's a game changer for me, you know? Of course, you know, because we talk a lot about it. But for every one of you who was listening to me, to us, I was, when I met Terry, more or less 10 years doing circles, a couple of hundreds, maybe 600, 800 circles with this type of cases. But sometimes I feel like I'm driving this car without really know where I'm going, you know? So having that chance to meet you, Terry, brings some clarity to my thoughts, to my practice. So in the interesting thing, I was struggling with you. What do you mean by practice and practices? What's the difference? So this thing become much more clear, and that's the thing that it's so hard to explain because it sounds so simple, and yet it is simple when you get to know it. So the way that you explain that, and especially in our training in Brasilia, we have 5 days with 40 people. You can remember that, of course. You remember that. It was amazing. The people looks, what is happening here? And they never asked us that kind of question. So the simple questions, the simpler they are, more profound the answers. So your restorative questions became much more. I could understand it, you know. I couldn't understand what you're talking, what you're explaining, what you're proposing to me. So everything's changed. My trainings from that point on are different, much more focused, much more explicit. So I get a sense now that I can help people in a great way, much more than before, much more than I can manage before. I get back to you, Terry.
It was interesting when the 5-day so-called training turned out to be a 5-day experience. They came with an expectation that they would have a higher level of skill. They left after 5 days, and in fact, we had to push them out of the room. They left with a much better understanding of themselves and their practice. And I guess that's the whole point of this webinar. I mentioned that.
Kerrie is always saying is the first thing is about yourself, and that's precisely what you did, what we did in this training. It's not a training; it's an experience. You have to experience yourself, your vulnerability, your shame, and all those things. Otherwise, you can never will be able to recognize it on the other people. So that's it. It's experiencing. That's what you have to do. So, Terry, I interrupted you. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I'd mentioned earlier I'd developed an explicit practice framework that has 5 elements. You might throw it up, Paulo. And the diagram you see has as its central focus relational capacity. In other words, stronger relationships. The ideal outcome that we're striving for. Each of the elements contribute to creating the conditions needed to build and sustain healthy relationships. There's nothing sequential about the diagram. The arrows attempt to illustrate the resonance and congruence between the various elements that ultimately shape the practice. As you can see, the 5 elements of working assumptions or really are about our foundational thinking, fair process, relational styles, and again, the old Socrates, Socratic engagement, and again, theoretical underpinnings. You know, I was thinking this morning as I was pulling my thoughts together, it's really unusual for a cop to have collaborated with others and identified a couple of theories that inform their practice, and I thought that's unusual. Let me just briefly explain the first element, which is the foundational thinking stuff. And then what I want to do is to invite Kerrie and Paulo in to talk about helped develop their practice that they could not only explain but could share. You know, when we saw that video, and I made reference to the importance of understanding how our values, beliefs, and experiences influence our motivation and ultimately shape our working assumptions. In brackets, foundational thinking appear. Now, what are assumptions? Why are they necessary? And what would working assumptions look like? Assumptions are critical to most things we do in everyday life. Without being guided by assumptions, life would be completely chaotic. A simple example is the assumption that those of you who registered are likely to participate in this webinar. Everything we do is influenced by assumptions. However, those assumptions that have no basis of fact, you know, are unhelpful and at times potentially dangerous. And another reason why we need to test our assumptions when it comes to practice. Now, the working assumptions. Now, many of you will say, I really struggle with this concept of working assumptions, but if we were sitting and talking with one another, and I say, where do you come from? What motivates you to do the work you do? What do you believe to be true in the work you do? The first thing you'd say is that relationships matter. And so I said, well, okay, let's develop a set of working assumptions that provide a scaffold or a roadmap. And because of time, I just want to very briefly step you through each of the working assumptions that I've developed as a general set of working assumptions. They're not just limited to those, but these are an indicative set. If relationships don't matter to you, nothing matters. So top of the pops is relationship helps shape our identity from which we derive life's meaning. The need to be loved, to be nurtured is fundamental. Now, what's interesting is the next dot point is that shame is the dominant affect of everyday life. Now, for many of you, that would seem to be a little strange, but I'll continue on because the work of Sylvan Tompkins, what he brings to my practice is a simple theory or a template that positions shame as one of 9 innate affects. And I want you to stop and think, what would happen if you or I never, ever got to experience shame? I want you to stop and think about that. There are many answers to that. We'd have no moral compass. We wouldn't know what feeling good was like. You know, there'd be no boundaries. We'd be sociopaths. So the reason that shame is the dominant affect of everyday life is when you think through it, its function, according to Sylvan Tompkins, is simple. It interrupts our feeling good or our good feeling. Now, let me just progress it. Those who are not able to do vulnerability, that is the shame, struggle with relationships. In other words, they're often disconnected from self, and as a consequence are disconnected from others. Remember Kerrie talking about the first of the 4 pillars was to be restorative with self. Next one is, how do we then create the conditions that allow those who are vulnerable to learn to sit with the discomfort of that vulnerability and be open to a different conversation? The second last point is that actually Sellen Tompkins provides a blueprint for what we call individual psychological and emotional wellness. And guess what? Coincidentally, the restorative questions I developed in 1991 provide a template. If I overlaid on Tompkins' blueprint, help create those conditions that optimize relationship building. Now, let me just progress this by saying the working assumptions actually provide a scaffold that shapes and guides my practice. But let me share a couple of key principles of our practice that we share very explicitly with those we're reaching out to. And the first one is, you are the expert in your own life. The second one is, the answers are to be found with you. Our role is to facilitate those processes that help you to make sense and meaning of what's happening in your life. See, one of the assumptions is that those we're reaching out to know and understand what's happening for them. Well, if they did, you or I wouldn't be needed. The second one is, help them discover what matters. The third one is to identify what needs to change and what their part in the change process will be. Now, here's one of the difficulties. You know, if every day people are victimised, and some of those matters end up in courts. You know, we have to be very clear that individual who's been victimised can't rely on validation from those who have caused the harm, and need to experience processes that allow them to make sense and meaning of what's happening for them, so they get to work out what matters. So in other words, they're not defined by someone else. They're often locked into an emotional holding pattern they're unable to get themselves out of, but they can't rely on that individual or individuals who have harmed them to journey or to move on. Now, the final thing is discover how to build and sustain healthy relationships. So a summary of the foundational thinkings means getting the alignment between the values, belief, experiences and evidence, the principles that guide what we do, the philosophy, the overall philosophy, and the working assumptions, so what matters for those you're reaching out to can be realised. Let me just make a quick comment about philosophy. The restorative philosophy we embrace is captured by my colleague Mark van der Vernen from Canada, who developed his notion of what he called restorative. And it's interesting because he says it's a way of thinking and being about creating the conditions, the safe spaces for those conversations that deepen relationships and build stronger, more connected communities. If I look back from my journey, when I first hit across restorative, around 1990, it was all about victims and offenders. Remember, I talked about my thinking and practice evolved from a focus on wrongdoing to building and sustaining relationships. I'm going to now invite Kerrie and Paulo to talk about the remaining elements and how they support our working assumptions. Let me just say that the working assumptions provide the scaffold. The dot points, are those linkages that can be reflected in terms of the key elements. So there's a synergy, not in any particular order, a synergy that helps us work towards achieving stronger relationships. Kerrie, you made reference to vulnerability and how important that is. So I really want you to think about the theory, and in this case, Tompkins, the bit about shame. What are some of the ways that you have been able to use this particular element, the theory element, and how have you shared it with others?
Yeah, thanks, Terry. Listen, I guess, and that comes back to that pillar number one again around, particularly as practitioners, we come with really big hearts. We want to make a massive difference to people's lives. But in fact, we don't have the answers. And by asking, going back to what Paulo was saying about those simple questions, and I saw Justin's made a comment as well around those simple questions is what creates the conditions for us to sit with that vulnerability, because we don't always have the answers. And I think as a leader, my vulnerability was when staff came to me and wanted me to give them the answers. One of my sayings is human beings, we're fix-it-making machines. We're really quick just to give an answer and something that's going to fix the problem, or we think it's going to fix the problem. But it's not sustainable change. And I think by using that Socratic questioning approach and asking those questions and being able to sit with that uncomfortable feeling of maybe I don't have all the answers. And in fact, maybe if I can just ask the right questions, that I can create the conditions for those, exactly what you just said, Terry, to make sense of meaning. So vulnerability and shame became a really big thing for us. And a lot of you would have seen this poster before, and how every time our feeling good is interrupted, as Terry talks about, this is the most dominant affect we experience. We have, as human beings, 9 innate affects, and shame is the one that interrupts our feeling good. It sets the social parameters. It basically tells us when we're not being the best version of ourselves. And see, the difference is, as a practitioner, I'd always get shared this information. I understand this, but I see it coming out in staff and clients all the time because I'm not good enough. This is shame is I am not enough. I'm not good enough. And we do the old attack self and put ourselves down all the time. So I had to work with staff in a way that stopped them as practitioners feeling this awful sense of shame constantly or not knowing what to do with it. And so we changed everything we did. And the visual tools that Terry firstly showed us with these posters became a critical element in our staff, as well as then working with young people and families. And the old echidna that I know Paulo's got some of these as well. And this came from Terry, around how we, every time our feeling good is interrupted, and I say to people all the time, when you get a bit snappy or a bit nasty with somebody, there's Paulo, he's got multiple going on. I've only got one with me on the houseboat today, and there's Terry's fluffy Australian echidna version. So it sets the social parameters. I say to people all the time, when you're a bit short and snappy or you're a bit grumpy with somebody you care about, I said, do you need that person to tell you? Or do you already get that spiky kind of feeling in your gut that tells us that we haven't been the best version of ourselves? So we would use this as a way of, after Terry teaching us that the echidna is all spiky, and every time our feeling good is interrupted, if we can't sit with that vulnerability, we have one of 4 ways of responding. So the question framework really helps us to open up and sit with that vulnerability in the context of relationship rather than continuing to have that response. So I'm going to share a very quick story about this and how we explicitly taught all of our clients about shame and vulnerability, because we're asking them to do something that's really uncomfortable. This becomes really solid learnt behavior, really easy to do rather than sitting with that uncomfortable feeling. So all of our staff had the poster pack. All of our staff had a little spiky echidna. And one of my staff tells me a story. She used to keep this on the front seat of her car. And we were in a assertive outreach case management service. So every time a young person would get in the car, they'd have to pick it up off the seat to actually sit down. And they'd say to her, "What's this?" And she'd say, "What animal does it look like?" And they would inevitably, everywhere, doesn't matter where in the world I've shared this story, and Terry, it came from you, and I know you've had the same experience, and I'm sure Paulo has as well. Everybody says porcupine, echidna, or hedgehog. And that or inevitably say, the kids say, it's like a hedgehog, a porcupine, or in Australia, an echidna. And she tells them, "Well, when does an echidna get into this shape?" And it gets its spikes out. And they have this whole story, and it's the way she unpacks and teaches them shame and then brings out the poster. So talking about explicit practice, Terry, one of my sayings is I should not be the holders of the information and knowledge. Everything I do and know that makes a difference, I should be able to share and articulate with those I serve in a way that they get to replicate it in their own lives. So hence explicitly teaching them about shame and using these visual tools as a way of helping them to navigate their own shame. And instead of having one of these responses, which is attack others, withdraw, avoid, or attack ourselves, which means we can never be in relationship with self or anybody else. We don't want to have those responses. We want to recognize we get that feeling, and we want to be able to open up and take care of things. And that's where we begin to understand ourselves and change our behavior. Paul, I'm going to throw to you, mate, because I know that you have some ways as well that you teach shame and be explicit about that.
Yeah. You already presented the Habermas mini-spheres. It became so handy to use that one with people who are struggling with their shame effect, or have been victimized, or have committed some damage to others. You always can use that to help them understand why they are struggling in their relationships, and why, when they are trying to defend themselves, they usually creates much more difficulty for the other people to reach them. I remember a story that Terry tell us here in Brazil, that there's this little kid, 7 years old maybe, when Terry asked him, "Do you know what it is? What is this?" "Oh yeah, we know." "And what happens?" And Terry said, "What needs to happen for a person to be that way?" "Oh, we need to talk about it. We need to talk." "And what happens when we're that way?" What the kid said, Terry?
He said, he said, "Can I show you something?" And I said, "For sure." He came out, and there are about 100 little 7-year-olds on the floor, and he said, "Can I have that?" And I said, "Well, you can use it. You can't have it." But anyhow, he put it out in front and closed, and he said, "When I'm there, which is there, there's only room for me. But when I get to open up, others can get in and help." I said to the kid, "Sit down, kid, I'm running this class." No, I didn't. I watched the teachers, their jaws dropped. So fundamentally, Brené Brown, in her video on vulnerability, talked about coming to this whole new insight, because she didn't understand the why, came to this insight around vulnerability, that those people who are able to embrace vulnerability, she called them wholehearted people. And what was particular about them were 3 distinguishing characteristics. The first was courage. Now, her take on courage was telling your story with your whole heart. The second was compassion, but what was different about her take on compassion was being kind to yourself before you be kind to others. And the other one was, the third one was connection, authentic need for connection. So if you think about Brené Brown's and overlay it on terms of what we're trying to do, is to get people to understand that what's happening for them is the shame affect that's keeping them out of relationship with themselves and as a consequence with others.
You know, Terry, I usually have two of them and show them what happens is if you're that way and the other person is that way too. How can you connect? You're just hurting each other. So the strongest one is the first one to open himself. So that's very useful. Have those Hoberman minispheres. Thank you for that, to presenting this idea.
So tell me, the relational styles, what does that mean, Paulo? How is that played out?
Okay.
How do you,
sorry?
How do you use it?
Okay. I usually, in my trainings, for example, I run some kind of a game, as we did in Brasilia, for people to try these different styles of relationship. For those who are not aware of what we are talking about, I have one here, but it's in Portuguese. I've translated. You probably have one in English. It would much, okay. Everyone is showing off their stuff now. What happened is a funny one is you remember you and me was in Brasilia. My older son was doing the translation. So I asked them, what kind of a father I am, what kind of relational style. Oh, you are the kind of relation who works against others. No, sometimes maybe as a father. Well, what happened is people doesn't always understand what they're doing to each other or to themselves. So this thing helped me to show them what they're doing in their relationships, what they are doing to themselves. So as Kerrie said, we start within myself. I start with myself. I need to change. I need to change the way that I behave, the way that I understand what they're talking to me, the way that I intend to talk to each other. So this piece is very important to that one. So when you start the conversation, I can always can ask them, where do you think you are at this point? You are doing things to each other, to the other one, for the other one, or with the other one. So it's a really great thing to use to show them how they can change the way they behavior and the way they are getting in relationship to others. So all those things, all those visuals that you created is so very useful. Again, it sounds so simple, and yet it is simple, but you need to learn how to use it. Otherwise, it's just it's just a toy. If you don't know how to use it, it's just a toy. But when you get to know how to use it, it became very powerful tool for this training. So in this particular thing, we use a one-on-one talk, much more than in circle or a conference. But this one-on-one talk, this one-on-one conversation is very useful. Go on, Kerrie.
So, Kerrie, tell us a bit about why this became so important in Re-engage.
Yeah, Kerrie, it became a critically important resource for us. Not sure why that's vibrating.
Okay.
Sorry, guys. That's better. This became a very big visual tool for us, not only as a staff team, but with our families and young people. So we had an open office area. We had these posters as well as the large versions of A3s all around the wall. And what became evident was staff used this as a tool to talk to each other. We created so much safety in the team and so much connection in the team that they would openly talk about their mistakes and when things went wrong, or they would hear conversations with other staff on the phone with families or other clients. And then they would finish the call and they would challenge each other and say, hey, which domain do you think you were operating out of in that phone conversation? And they were able to challenge their own practice and each other's practice in a way that held us accountable to try to be in the with box as much as we can. So what we want to do is match our expectation with the amount of support and work with people. But you know what? We wake up every single day to be the best versions of ourselves, but they're internal and external factors that push us around here. We're not bad people. We're not bad practitioners. But it's about recognizing when we're in the 2 box, the not box, or the 4 box, and getting ourselves back into the with, because that's where we learn. But I want to share one really quick story, Terry. Again, how we explicitly use this with families. So again, as practitioners, we used to go out when we used to get a first referral and intake and do what we always got taught to do, get all the paperwork signed and fill out the consent forms and tell them all about the wonderful programs that we've got for them, and here's our menu of services. And after we started to do everything through a relational lens, a restorative lens, however you want to describe it, we use these visuals to start talking to families. We'd go out there and ask them critical questions about their family and what it was like having us attend their house today. And then we would explain who we were and what our expectations were and how we're going to support them to meet them and how we want to work with them. And we'd ask them to hold us accountable as practitioners. And I remember one day one of my staff coming back and telling me a story. She said, Kerrie, I explained the practice domains and how I want them to, I'm going to work with them, but I'm going to have expectation of them, and this is how I'm going to support them. She said, and then I handed the poster to the mum, and she burst into tears. And her response was, when she gathered herself, she said, for 10 years, I've had welfare, as she describes, as Hilary Cotman describes, in and out of my home for the last 10 years. And you are the first practitioner, or the first person, she described it, that ever asked me what my expectations of you are. They all come into my home thinking they're the experts in me and my family. And for 10 years later, how on earth has there been no change in that family? Because we as practitioners come with big hearts and we want to make the greatest difference. But we do everything for them or to them rather than working with them and having the same expectation of ourselves, which means we have to be vulnerable as practitioners, which means we as leaders have to be vulnerable and create vulnerability. I hope that helps.
So, Kerrie, remember the first training I ran with your small staff of 10? And I asked you to model. I asked you to model how you engage a young person who comes to your agency, doesn't want to be there, okay, generally mandated, doesn't want to be there. Yep. And one of your staff volunteered, and I stopped him about 7 minutes in, and I said, you know, what are you doing, really? It seems like you're after information, and the idea of engagement isn't evident. Tell me what happened after that.
The modelling we did?
Yeah.
Yeah, it seriously changed, because myself and our staff, we just couldn't quite get the headset of not going out there and having all the answers. You know, as social workers, youth workers, practitioners, you know, we go out to families and think, so we just completely changed our engagement. We completely changed. We put the paperwork aside, and yes, we still tick the boxes. But in fact, when we turned up to a family's home, the first thing we would say to them is, what was it like when I phoned you and was booking an appointment to come and see you and your family? What was it like waiting for me to turn up today? Tell me some of the best things about your family. And we actually wanted to create the conditions, Terry, where they got to tell their story. because story is connection, and story is what disintegrates shame. And that's that was a significant shift for us. It seems like it's so small and so on one level so insignificant, but the way it changed practitioners' experiences of being able to contribute in a way where they actually got to understand the difference they were making for the first time in their careers was the game changer for them and for the young people and families.
Do you know, you developed a little booklet because you fundamentally changed all your procedures and policies. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we created our a full practice manual. Every policy and procedure got thrown out the window. Well, it didn't get thrown out the window. That's probably a bit of an exaggeration. We put a relational lens over every single thing we did. Every policy procedure, how we engaged staff, and we had a really explicit practice manual. It wasn't about programs anymore. It was around, this is the fundamental underpinnings of our practice, and this is how we all practice and engage each other as well as young people and families. See, here's the other thing. I never, ever have an expectation of my staff, the young people, families or communities that I serve that I don't have of myself. And that in itself is vulnerability and not having all the answers as a practitioner or as a leader, but sitting with that space. But that manual, that practice manual, created consistency, it created safety, and it created continuity for families. They knew exactly what was going to happen and how it was going to happen. And in fact, it took the power out of the relationships and it put us on more of an equal playing field when we had this consistent way of engaging.
What about your storybook?
Oh, my assessment tool, my journey. So assessment tool. So we actually started putting that at the centre of everything we did. And we started to ask people their life journey and their story. And then we would get them to map what I call their community of care. Who are the people in their relationships and in their life? And what are the nature of those relationships? And we saw our critical role of having them to tell their story to us in a way that it was their narrative and that we got to understand and work with them from the perspective of what they wanted. And that fundamentally changed as well. We created this beautiful, I wish I had it with me on the houseboat to show you all. I'll keep that for the training and make sure I share that. But young people would ask for their journey. Can I get my journey? Can I get my storybook out? And they wanted to add things and visuals to their own story and journey, which was a very different way of operating with organisations. And I can see one of our colleagues, Terry Gemma, making a few comments here from the University of Newcastle. And I just want to share that I've also watched Gemma do very similar application in the university with 1,800 people in a campus. And they've completely changed the way they build and engage residents and use these same visual tools like we did. And that's what heartens me. Relationships are the centre of lifelong learning and success. It doesn't matter whether you're working with young people, with elderly people in a university context. The power of putting relationships at the centre fundamentally changes people's experience.
In 2016, your organisation, Reengage, was recognised by Business Review Weekly, which is the most rigorous workplace evaluation. You were recognised as the 6th best Australian workplace. In fact, not only did you have a staff of 80 odd, but you had a workload of nearly 1,000 young people, at-risk young people and their families. I remember very clearly the last full staff meeting we had, and it was called a year in review. I facilitated it. And can you remember some of those reflections of your staff about where they're at? Can you share a couple of those?
Yes, you fondly reminded me yesterday, Terry, when we had a chat, and I was reading through them, and when we changed, one of the fundamental changes we made, we changed everything, staff meetings, everything. And I'll just give you a really quick practical example, and this is why I think we got the feedback we got, Terry, which was one of the first things in the staff meetings I did was a change. We put high fives and critical reflections, which means we were asking people in an open forum in front of all of their colleagues, as well as all of their leaders and senior management, to share their mistakes, share things that didn't work, but also share the high fives, the things that worked really well and the outcomes that they got. And by creating this rigorous opportunities to bring people together in circle to have these conversations created vulnerability. It created that space for others to make sense of connection, and that's what Paul's saying in his comments as well. And it's so true, because when we got to the end of year in review, Terry, when I read things like when something goes wrong, I challenge myself and I grow. The place of purposeful intent, I'm growing as a practitioner. It's changed how I parent my own children. They're talking about, the level of vulnerability, the creativity that was created in that. For staff to talk about this in this way in front of everybody, comfortable in conflict. Who says that often in a workplace, that they're comfortable in conflict? And conflict's a normal part of our relationships. So we have to create the conditions where they're comfortable to deal with that conflict that happens.
Let me go to Paulo, and I want to come back to you about the kit that everyone ended up with on staff. Paulo, tell me about the restorative Socratic engagement, about the use of the questions. How does that help you, and how do you use it with others? I know I can't understand what you've got on the cards, so accept that it was a translation of what I wrote. But so how do you use that?
Well, Terry, at first, when I first heard about these restorative questions, was in 2013, I guess. And at that point, to be real, I didn't understood the idea, because I was working with the Socratic process. The questioning is always open-ended questions and etc. So I was in that path, but not using those questions, because when they presented me those questions, they said, "Oh, you need to use it precisely that way, the way that are written, and etc." And that's the first thing that you said to me when we met. No, it doesn't need to be precisely that way. The idea is here. You need to talk about the past, the present, and the future, and those kind of questions will help you. So, and when I first talk to you about that, you know that I usually ask questions about feelings and emotions. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about that, and etc. So you said to me, no, I don't ask feeling questions. I ask reflection, thinking questions. And I said, but why? We need to know how the people are feeling within ourselves and with others. And you said, you know what? When you ask feeling questions, what are the answers? I don't know, or maybe one or two words. And when you ask them, what do you think? What do you realize when you realize what happened? So the difference isn't on the answers. Is at the answers they answer talking about their feeling, their emotions, their relationships, but in a much more profound way. So as Justin Mui said, yeah, you need to ask simple questions, and those questions that you put on is very simple but very profound. So what happened from that point on, Kerrie, I started using that, because now at that point I realized how to use it, how can I put it on my work. So I can never forget when you tell in our trainings here in Brazil, and you said, you know what? I know exactly what everyone in the conferencing will say and will do. But how? Because I asked those questions. I asked those questions in one-on-one preparation, and I asked the same questions at the conferencing or at the circle. So I know what they will talk about. And it's true. It's very true. So when you have this scaffold, you will put on all those ideas in a precise way you know what they are talking about. So it makes the practice much more explicit, much more oriented, much more clear, much more profound. So those questions, when you really learn how to use them, it's amazing. And that's, let me do a little promotion of what we're doing next. You guys who are here with us, we'll open this training, online training, me, Terry, and Kerrie. And one of the things that was the most amazing is they had to have this chance to have a chance to talk about these restorative questions with Terry, because that's the guy who created it, who put it all together. So when you get the chance to really understand why you ask those questions in that manner, what are the results? So what really changed, Terry? It's not what I'm doing, but what I'm getting back as answers to those questions. Again, the questions are very important to create this roadmap to people to really understand what they're talking about. The same question for everyone. So that creates a space where they can really start to understand each other. They can reconnect. They can connect again and go through those harm and those difficult times. Go on, man.
So a simple example, you've got cards, little cards like that. And what I would typically do and what Kerrie does is, if I work in a school, every kid in a school ends up with 2 cards, one for them and one for their families. And when this develops some momentum and is embedded, the kids learn how to facilitate their own conversations. And let me point out, I mentioned my colleague Lynn Doppler, and another colleague, another 2 colleagues, Liz and Vic O'Callaghan, who were principals at McKillop Primary School. My collaboration with both of those schools led to the creation of a what I call a sand pit that helped us all learn how to be much more explicit. Okay, now we were a little history is this was developed by Ted Wachtel and Paul McCall. For those who you don't know who Ted Wachtel is, Ted Wachtel was the co-author of Tough Love, the International Parent Support Movement. I first met Ted in 1994, and when I presented in Doylestown in Pennsylvania with Don Nathanson. And what happened was Ted had been running alternative schools and group homes for at-risk kids. It describes an epiphany that resulted in him following me to Australia, establishing an international organisation that was initially called Real Justice and now is the International Institute for Restorative Practice. I guess Ted is another one of those collaborators that have been so crucial in my and everyone else's journey of moving towards a much more explicit approach. There's a bit that I wanted just to point out. I didn't want this to be about restorative. I wanted it to be about practice within which we can start to use the restorative elements as a way of strengthening mainstream practice. Let me quickly come to, I'm mindful of the time, come back to Kerrie and say, talk a bit about what happened when the inevitable occurred. That is a large organisation, 80-odd employees, high workload, at-risk kids.
Yep.
Tragic things were going to happen for some kids and for some staff, how did all of the sort of developmental stuff integrating this became part of your DNA? How did that help with the situation?
Yeah, it's a great question, Terry, and you're spot on. Unfortunately, in the work we do when we're working with at-risk young people and families and communities, is that we are sometimes exposed to that risk for not only our young people but also our staff. And it critically changed everything for us. And when I had a staff member who was actually critically assaulted in a home visit, we were able to put relational lens over everything we did. And don't get me wrong, guys, we're all used to the work cover, the legislative system. We still have to tick all the boxes and go through all of those processes. But what I did and what we did as a team and an organisation is we put the staff member and her family at the centre of every decision we made. And through that restorative lens, and staff were used to coming together in a proactive way. Staff were connected because we did regular circle work in a positive way. We didn't just wait for things to go wrong. And so what everything we did through a relational lens, and Terry, you remember me ringing you because I wasn't the right person to facilitate the processes because I was impacted and harmed. And I had Terry fly immediately down to this community with me and run processes. And we met with her family first, and circled up, and Terry ran a process with myself and her family. We did that with our staff team. We did that with a broader staff team that we're co-located within this country town. And it fundamentally changed. And I remember her father saying to me at the end of the conversation, why are you even here? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, why are you even here? My daughter's an adult. You have no responsibility. And I said, I have every responsibility. I said, relationships are important to us. And there's been relational impact and harm here. So we believe that that's the most important thing that we have to work on and work together with. And we journeyed for about 4 odd months, and as an organisation, as a team, and I'll fast forward to the end. And I remember the work cover, the government body, the statutory body, ringing me for the final closure meeting. This work cover case had been closed. She was critically hurt. She was in hospital for a period of time. We did things like fly her partner home from overseas. We did things that organisations would normally not do, because we're so legislatively driven and we want to tick the boxes and make sure we run all the processes properly. But actually, when we put relationships at the centre, 4 months after this critical assault, she was able to close her work cover case and return to work, because we were able to put relationships at the centre and offer her a space that helped her deal with the vulnerability and the hurt and the harm that was caused and move forward in a way. And they came to me and they said, what did you do differently? And I said, what do you mean? And the state manager of the government body said, what did you do differently? We've never had such a serious assault where the case is closed 4 months later and the person's returning to work and doing really, really well. And it was about relationships. It was about using restorative, explicit practice and processes with ourselves and each other, as well as with our young people and families, that was able to make the greatest difference. And it completely blew my mind. Their results I never expected. I was looking for this program that was going to make the greatest difference. But actually what I got was a practice framework that actually made the greatest difference personally, professionally, for my colleagues and for young people in communities. And that was the game changer for me as a practitioner. And I'll just quickly share, Terry, but maybe come back with me in the convo, is the young man, the young people as well. We had a young person who unfortunately took their life. And again, that's one of the terrible things that we have to deal with in this sector. But being able to work with staff and the young people in the same school that were in class with this particular young person the day before and offer them processes and ways of coming together. But again, we didn't just wait for things to go wrong to bring them together. We were regularly bringing together to build strong, healthy, connected relationships so that when harm occurred, they had a strong sense of community, a strong sense of self and connection. And these are some of the most at-risk young people in our state. They were able to come together in a way by using explicit practice, because we could teach them how we're going to work with them. We could teach them how they're going to have this awful feeling inside and how they can sit with that uncomfortable space, but how they can be connected together and open up and deal with stuff. And this is what critically changed those environments.
So everyone was given a kit. The kit comprised of a series of templates, little cards.
Yep, they all hits the full templates, the cards, the big question cards, Everybody got a Hoveman sphere. We all had talking pieces as well that we used for circle work. Everybody had this, and we went everywhere. We outreach in our office, everywhere was all part of this.
Just let me flick back to Paulo. Paulo, the element that that I want you to chat about is this notion of fair process. It was a Harvard article called Fair Process that in 1997 my brother found it and sent it to me, and really it's the core of what makes the difference. That is the process. If it's fundamentally fair, individuals can live with any outcome. So how important has that been in terms of your practice and the way you engage?
Terry, I lost you for a moment. You are asking about the fair process.
Fair process element.
Okay.
Just how has that helped you, and talk about some of the ways you use that element.
Again, it's about being much more clear about what is happening and what you expect to happen afterwards. So when you became a much more explicit and articulate in your ideas, in your beliefs, and your working assumptions, and etc. So you can put all these things together. And talking about fair processes is very important when you work with people. For example, as Kerrie said before, in their organizations, when you have this fair process and people are really engaged and people really understand what is happening, your expectations are real clear, they can manage to work together. So when you really put on these things together, you have those people working with you, as you always say in this relational style, that they work with you. You're not doing the things for anyone. You're just helping them to start working, collaborate, much more than collaborate, to engage with each other. So when you put on this fair process, the people really start to engage in the conversations, and the behavior changes a lot, because from this point on, everything makes sense. Everything is much more clear, and the people, as we show at the beginning of this webinar, the video of Michael Jr., the people will get much more impacted on these practices. So you really need to be fair. You really need to be clear on what you were expecting for them in terms of relationships, in terms of behavior, and so on. So again, every time, it is simple. Yeah, it is simple, but you need to know, you need to understand the why you're doing that. It's always about the why you're doing that, the why you're asking them to do or not to do, to say or not to say something. And again, the most important thing for me on the subject of fair processes is to really respect everyone in the room. They are the experts, as you always say. They are the experts. We just help them to find the answers. We don't provide the answers. Never. We provide the questions. That's it.
So one of the things that Professor Donald Nathanson said to me many years ago, as we worked around this, he said to me, Terry, I really want you to understand that we don't have to coach people in how they deal with their emotions. He said, what we have to do is to create the space for them to work it out for themselves. So the idea of fair process. And I guess if we go back to Kerrie's story around the mum that burst into tears, you know, what we do is rather than tell them about fair process, we ask them about it. And a typical example of that is to say, think of an experience that you had in which you felt you weren't treated fairly. What was missing or was needed? And invariably what happens, and it's a universal response, they identify what are termed the three elements of fair process that you just talked about: engagement, opportunity to tell your story, explanation, really understanding why things happen, and the last one, which Kerrie alluded to, was
Terry,
the idea. Yeah.
we have a question here that I think that resonates with what you just said. Probably it will be a good thing for you to make some comment on that. Look at that. Can Terry, Kerrie, and Paulo reflect on application in different cultural contexts and the broader issues that can have an impact, such as Aboriginal deaths in custody and Black Lives Matter? So that's really a big thing now at this point on what happens in the United States. And you, Terry, have something to say about that?
Well, I do, because apart from always being across policing, I'm also very involved in developing processes around Indigenous communities. And look, the bottom line is the response to that is really to create an opportunity for dialogue that allows those, in this case, Aboriginal people, to share what really matters for them and why it matters. In other words, Tom Tyler wrote a book called Why People Obey the Law. And this is key to really understanding what effective policing is about. He found that those who are more likely than not to obey the law got to experience fair and respectful processes. And, you know, if we think about Kerrie's comment about the mum who burst into tears, what the mum was actually saying, I actually matter in this. I matter. My story is important. Goodness gracious. And look, this is the whole issue about Black Lives Matter. You know, it really is about a fundamental lack of engagement with all of us that allows us to discover what matters. And it's our connection as human beings that is discovered when you have the right conversation. And I guess COVID, in a funny way, has acted as a reset. And that the conversations I hear, both in my neighbourhood and more generally, is a greater focus on talking about the things that matter. And that's been critical. So, Kerrie, you're outside now? Just hanging about?
The River Murray. I'm sitting on the outside of the houseboat.
Well done. So, look, we've been going a bit over a couple of hours. Paulo, I guess we probably should move towards wrapping it up. Kerrie, what are your thoughts on all of this? What are your final thoughts?
I'm excited, Terry, about, I remember meeting you and I remember trying to get my head around this explicit practice, but the more we as practitioners can share and articulate our practice with those we serve, that they get to replicate it in their own life, the more we get to start with what I say with the end in mind, and that's us being out of their lives in a good, healthy, positive way. So for me, that's the critical part about this. If we can get people to be more explicit and share our practice, we get to stop doing the heavy lifting and we get to work with people. So I'm excited about the training. I'm excited about the story and the journey and the conversations moving forward.
Let me make my final comment before I invite Paulo to do that and then to wrap it up. If I were to condense all of this into a simple set of moving parts, one is regardless of where we're operating in our professional domains or personal domains, that the impediment to meaningful relationships has to do with our inability to deal with vulnerability. What I learned from your experience, Kerrie, was when you created that conditions with all of your staff and your leadership group, where vulnerability became that critical opportunity for learning and growth, as Brené Brown talks about it, and that it's reflected in the summary of the feedback. What you end up doing, and this is what happened, you created a modelling that you then encourage them to go out and road test with young people and their families. You know, my colleague Lynn Doppler always said to staff, be the change you want to see in others. And look, at one level, you know, this sort of explicit framework may seem to be complex, but it really isn't. I think that as a society, we're suffering from what I call paralysis by analysis. I see far too much of this pathologizing behaviour. And all I'm saying is let's just step back and make sense of who we are and what matters for us as a precursor to stepping into someone else's space and inquiring of them about what matters. If we can build that connection, they, the experts, can find their own answers. Paulo.
You know, Terry, we should probably ask those people who are watching us again these two simple questions. Why you do what you do? Why doing that works? So perhaps after a little more than 2 hours, you now have make more sense on those questions. You can be more clear and answer those questions. But if you're not, that's okay. It's difficult. It's simple but difficult. And the idea here, guys, is in a few days, me, Terry, and Kerrie will put on this online training, you know, and it's all about the why. The why, and that's the most important thing that we are talking about 2 hours now. To discover the why we do what we do, and why doing that works. So this thing we want to really do profound reflection, doing profound reflections on that stuff. We will probably in a few days we'll start advertising, promoting this training. Will be 24 hours online training. And we work on this, all the stuff that Terry was talking about, me and Kerrie, about the why, about to understand the working assumptions, the restorative questions, all those scaffold that Terry uses to explain the work and what they do, what we are doing in our jobs. So the idea here is to just show you a little bit of these reflections and to help you to get a much more sense on why you do what you do and why doing that works. So, Terry, I don't know if you want to share a few words about this online training, 24 hours training that we'll put on in a few days.
Yeah, we just need to be explicit. When we say 24 hours, we're not suggesting it goes for 24 hours in one block. Okay. The second thing is that in a few days, we will call for expressions of interest. Maybe a week. Kerrie's away on the houseboat, so we might give her a bit of space. But within the next 2 weeks, those of you who are interested, and what we will do is we'll design a process that really is an opportunity for you to journey with us and others in a collaborative way. So meaning that we get to learn from one another, but not only to begin to help others to work out and answer those questions, but for us to actually give them examples of how you model that process in a way that allows them to understand that the scaffold, the roadmap, has a very practical application in terms of how they engage others. That's basically what we've got to offer. Kerrie?
Yeah, no, I just reiterate the same. I'm really looking forward to it. I grow and learn every day, and it is a journey. Restorative practice is a lifelong personal and professional journey, and I'm just excited about what's going to come out of it. I'm also excited what I'm going to learn from others and how we can do this more deliberately, more intentionally, and more on purpose, personally and professionally. So thanks for great morning, guys, and thanks everyone for joining us, and I really look forward to the next conversation.
Yeah. So, Paulo, final word.
Well, I like to thank everyone who watched all this stuff, all this webinar, and I invite you guys to spread the word. And this webinar will be available in this YouTube channel. Okay, you can pass on this link for people to watch it. We are available for you. If you can ask questions anytime. Terry doesn't use Facebook, but me and Kerrie, yes, we use it. So you can post your comments, your questions there. We'll be very happy to manage to have those questions answered. And we probably, as Terry said, we'll leave Kerrie alone for a time to be at the boat, at the river, and later on we'll put on this promoting. We will promote this online training 24 hours. We're doing the way that will be very easy to be with us in this training. No, don't worry. So thank you, Terry. Thank you, Kerrie. Thank you all who was with us all this time. Many thanks.
Can I pose? Thank you. Can I pose a final question for you, Paulo? What would happen?
I don't know. Maybe.
What would happen if the president of Brazil were to meet with the president of the USA? I'll leave you to think about that one. Bye for now. Thank you.
See you guys. Have a great rest of your week. See you,
Bye-bye,
and Leah and Lynn. Lots of Iris as well. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys, from all around the world will be as with us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.